It's 7 o'clock. Welcome. I'd like to call this meeting of the Lakewood City Council for Monday, June 15th to order. Madam Clerk.
Thank you.
Councilmember Boki,
Present.
Councilmember Brandstetter,
Here.
Councilmember Farmer,
Here.
Councilmember Moss,
Here.
Councilmember Simpson,
Here.
Deputy Mayor Whalen,
Present.
and Mayor Anderson.
Here.
You have a quorum?
Thank you. Now we will move to the public comment section of the agenda. Obviously, that's all altered because of the COVID rule moderations or modifications to the Open Public Meetings Act. And public comments were accepted via mail or email and were sent to Brianna Schumacher at the city clerk at 6000 Main Street Southwest, Lakewood, Washington, or B. Schumacher at cityoflakewood.us. Comments received up to 1 hour before the meeting were provided to the city council electronically. Comments received after that deadline will be provided to the city council after the meeting. I'm aware of a number of comments that have been received and forwarded on to council members. Ms. Schumacher, would you please read the identity of the people who have submitted comments for consideration?
Mayor Anderson, we received 16 comments via email. Those comments were received from Charles Ames, Nancy Anderson, Carol Byron, Judith Case, Dana Clausen, Jody Coy, Maria Dudang-Dara, Melissa Dudang-Dara, Donald Oust, Brady Lewin, Manfred Elmer, Francis Marquardt, Hai Fan, Robert Pock, Joanne Sutzler, and Virginia Woodley.
Okay, thank you. We will now move to the consent agenda. Madam Clerk.
A, approval of the minutes of the City Council study session of May 26, 2020. B, approval of the minutes of the City Council meeting of June 1st, 2020. C, motion number 2020-30, approving the 2021 through 2022 Human Services Funding Process. D, motion number 2020-31, authorizing the execution of an agreement with the Washington State Department of Commerce to receive $1,790,100 in coronavirus relief funds. E, motion number 2020-32, authorizing the execution of the Pierce County Force Investigation Team Memorandum of Understanding. And F, items filed in the Office of the City Clerk, Planning Commission meeting minutes of May 20th, 2020.
Thank you. Is there any item which any member of the council wishes to have removed from the consent agenda? Mr. Brandstetter.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to remove item C, motion number 220-30.
Okay, item C has been removed. Is there any other? Seeing none, I entertain a motion to adopt the consent agenda less item C, which is motion number 2020-30.
So moved.
Seconded.
It's been moved by Mr. Whalen, seconded by Mr. Simpson, that we adopt the consent agenda less item C. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay. We now move to, motion carries. We now move to motion number 2020-30, approving the 2020-21, 2020-22 Human Services Funding Process. Mr. Brandstetter. You're on mute, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I asked to have this item removed from the consent agenda so that when it is before us, I could propose a couple of amendments. I'm concerned that the item as it's presented and recommended to us is essentially a process as usual going forward with a link to the biennial budget process that essentially sets up a a way to move things forward for 2 years. But I think that we are in an unusual situation right now with respect to, first is revenue projections we have uncertainty about, other than we're certain that there is going to be some reductions in revenue, but we also don't know how long those reductions are going to impact, whether it will only be in the first year of the biennium or for 2 years. And secondly, that while I understand that the Community Services Advisory Board sought some input and felt that there were not going to be significant new needs in the coming biennium brought on by either COVID-19 or by other social issues that are ongoing in the community. I don't think that that's something to be relied upon with certainty this far out from 2022. I think that it's prudent for us to make some amendments to this process so that it doesn't have as far or long a horizon as an entire biennium. And I'll offer my amendments after we get the motion on the floor.
Okay, I'd entertain a motion.
I would move adoption of motion 2020-30.
So
Second.
seconded.
Okay, it's been moved by Mr. Brandstetter, seconded by Mr. Simpson, that we adopt motion number 2020-30. Mr. Brandstetter, you have an amendment?
Mr. Mayor, I move to amend the motion to remove access to food as a 2021 funding strategy.
Is there a second to the amendment?
There is.
Then moved by Mr. Brandstetter, seconded by Mr. Simpson, that food as access to food as a funding strategy be removed. Is there any further discussion, Mr. Brandstetter?
I would say that the motion that's before us keeps 5 funding strategies as in previous years, but in a circumstance of where we know there's going to be a reduction in funding, that I think that this particular funding strategy, removing it for a year, allow us to perhaps more robustly continue the other 4 strategies, which have not gotten significant new funding interest from other sources as has been going on. And so I think that removing it and focusing on the remaining 4 with the remaining revenue dollars that we will have after whatever reduction there is in 1% is a prudent thing to do.
Any other comments?
Just a
Mr.
question.
Whalen?
Just so I'm clear, the impact, Mr. Brandstetter, on the proposed motion would effectively what, eliminate, is it $25,000, which is the funding ceiling?
No, it would mean that rather than accepting applications and spreading the entire 1% across 5 strategies,
Mm-hmm.
we would only ask for applications for 4 strategies and dividing the money that we have amongst those 4.
So the motion, I believe, stems from some recognition on council's part that due to the COVID monies flowing to the county and now from Department of Commerce to the city, that the food strategy itself will be funded by alternate sources in lieu of our 1% human services funding?
In part, and that's certainly true for the remainder of this year, but going into next year, there is renewed interest to do that. And that there is also some federal level actions by the Department of Agriculture where they have, in response to the crisis, are greatly increasing a stock of surplus food that they have, where there is an intent to then distribute that broadly to meet the needs for food that's out there. I think there's it's also a strategy that the funding that we've provided in the past has been a lower percentage of the funding overall than for some of the groups that are providing some of the other strategies.
Okay. Thank you.
Further discussion for the vote? Well, Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You know, I was listening to Councilmember Branstetter, and I understand where he's coming from because there's so much that we don't know. If we do 1 year, and then it's easier to add to than to take away from once it's been in action. So I think that that's a good idea.
Just to,
Mr. Whalen?
yeah, just to clarify, I believe the motion on the table is just to remove access to food as a 2020 funding strategy as opposed to all of the strategies for just a 1 year period of time.
The motion is to remove it as a 2021 strategy. It already is a 2020 strategy that we're currently funding.
This is
Okay.
prospective. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm okay with that.
Any other comments? Looking around for electronic hands. All those in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay.
Nay.
Okay, Madam Clerk, roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Moss,
Aye.
Councilmember Simpson,
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Whalen,
Nay.
Councilmember Boki,
Nay.
Councilmember Branstetter.
Aye.
Councilmember Farmer,
Nay.
Mayor Anderson.
Nay.
4-3, motion fails.
Did you have another amendment, Mr. Branstetter?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Motion fails, please.
I would move to amend the motion to remove reference to the 2021-2022 budget development process.
For the sake of discussion, I'll second that just to hear what Mr. Branstetter has to say.
It's been moved by Mr. Branstetter, seconded by Mr. Simpson to remove the reference to the budget development process. Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, the impact of this motion is to have the process impact only funding for 2021, as opposed to the normal process that it's approved that it would be a process for approving human services 1% funding for the entire upcoming biennium. And I think, again, I refer to the uncertainty as to what's going to happen in 2021 and how similar to 2021 will 2022 be, both with respect to needs and with respect to revenue.
So you, so I understand it correctly before we vote, Mr. Branstetter, we should motion only to this process for 2022? That that the current process is eliminated? Or
Well,
2021, 22?
I guess that I would characterize it as saying that it's to approve the process to allocate funding for 2021 and not for both 2021 and 2022.
Okay.
And the process that includes both the funding strategy, the needs, and normally what we sort of just automatically continue 1 year's approval contracts into the next year. I think that there is enough uncertainty that perhaps that we as a council want to consider in greater detail 2022 strategies once we are a ways through 2021 and have good data on revenue and emerging needs.
Mr. Volkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So Mike, you're just saying, let's do a 1-year process because of the uncertainty with the economy and whatnot. So I believe the objection from the committee might be, hey, this is an extensive process and that's why we do it for 2 years. I think that's the reason. Is that why we do it now for 2 years? And how do you respond to, you're just creating twice as much work for us?
Well, my historical perspective is that when we went from a 1-year to a biennium-based process, it was in part because we saw continuity and need throughout bienniums, and that some of the agencies that were receiving funding felt that they liked greater predictability of having 2 years of funding, of where in the second year they didn't have to reapply. With respect to, I just think that the uncertainty isn't the same now. And that if we get to a point a year from now where we're trying to decide on the next year, 2022 process, if we decide on an abbreviated process that gives credit for having a 2021 project, we could do that. If we see a new funding strategy, such as the one for the workforce development program that was in our briefing a week ago, that we wanted to move forward with 2022, we don't necessarily have to start from nothing in 2022. We can craft a process that is perhaps less work intensive, but still takes the opportunity to look at the data for what is reality, 9, 10 months from now.
Mr. Whalen.
Thank you. In the request for council action under discussion in our packet on pages, looks like 14 and 15, there is a comment in the discussion about the contracts. It's like 1, 2, 3, 5th bullet down. The contracts are for 1 year. Council will review options for the second year funding in 2021. If this is the recommendation and part of the discussion coming forward to us, it appears that we would have some discretion for reviewing those options anyway in the second year of funding. So I'm not sure that we necessarily need to restrict it by way of this motion tonight. I'm also kind of concerned about whether or not we are creating additional and unnecessary work for the committee and the part-time FTE staff person. What I heard from our study session was that the needs will likely not change. but rather they may be exacerbated as a result of our recent conditions with COVID, and who knows? I agree that it's a fluid situation with regard to any number of events that could appear before the city. But I think that we've got some discretion, and certainly I think the committee would have discretion a little bit as we get into the funding recommendations this year. So I would be inclined to kind of leave it alone, but if council would like to have further flexibility suggested by Mr. Brandstetter, I'm fine with that as well.
So one option here is to make sure that when we approve the actual budget for this, that we only budget 1 year.
Right. Yeah.
To avoid keeping or creating a false impression that the money is secure for the recipients. As I'm a little hesitant to look out over the horizon too far. Some things are, for example, today for 2020, I don't think any food bank needs to worry about having enough funding.
Mm-hmm.
There's money floating around that from a variety of sources. There may be some logistical problems getting it there, but there's robust funding. Is there funding for legal assistance for victims of domestic violence? That's a little harder to find. Who knows what those needs are going to be 18 months from now. So I can go either way on the motion, but I think we should be cautious about extending out our commitment too far. Mr. Volkey, you wish to speak again, or just not take your hand down? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll take my hand down too.
Anyone else?
Oh, I thought my hand was down.
Well, then we'll, would you restate your motion, Mr. Brensler, before we vote on it?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. I move to amend the motion to remove reference to the 2021-2022 budget development process. This was a language recommended to me by staff. I wanted to limit commitments to 1 year at this particular point in time, and go through a thorough review of a process for 2022 in the future.
All right. All in favor of the motion to amend, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We now move to motion number 2020-30 as amended. Is there any further discussion? Seeing no hands or waves on the screen. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed,
Aye.
nay. The motion carries. Thank you. We now move to the regular agenda, public hearings and appeals. Madam Clerk.
This is the date set for a public hearing on the 2020 Annual Development Regulations and Multifamily Tax Exemption Code Amendments.
This is the time when we accept public testimony, which under the amended COVID-19 Open Public Meeting Act rules are accepted via mail or email. Comments were sent to Brianna Schumacher, City Clerk at 6000 Main Street Southwest, Lakewood, Washington, 98499, or B. Schumacher at cityoflakewood.us. Were any comments received?
Mayor Anderson, we received no comments for this public hearing.
Ms. Spear, would you please advise us as to what was being considered for public testimony?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if you look at page 56 of your packet, you'll see the actual documents within your weekly meeting packet, but I'm going to quickly go through this presentation on your screen. So again, this is two pieces actually within one. This is the annual development regulation amendment package, and then there's a proposed new chapter regarding the property tax exemption for multifamily properties within the packet for you. On June 8th, you did consider the Planning Commission's Resolution 2020-02 and its recommendations regarding the development regulation package. They came from a variety of sources, but essentially both staff and the public using the development code, not only 18A, but other related titles of the Lakewood Municipal Code, and identifying either Scrivener changes or statutory or case law changes, what have you, just needed some cleanup within the titles overall. And then there was also on June 8th, the review by the council of a proposed new version of the property tax exemption program in order to reflect current state law as well as municipal code best practices. So you have scheduled this hearing tonight. Apparently there's been no comments received, but very quickly to summarize, it's titles 1, 12, 14, 15 and 17, as well as a number of changes within 18A for the development code changes. And then there's a new chapter, as I mentioned, for the property tax exemptions. A couple of points here. The idea in part is to do away with the process of identifying tax incentive urban use centers and maintain residential target areas. And so with that being done, you'll see the map on your left, that would go away. And the only map that would remain or would be added to the comprehensive planning and zoning map would be the one on the right, residential target areas. One thing to note between the two maps is, unlike the Central Business District and the Lakewood Station's TIUUCs, the Springbrook TIUUC is a different and a larger boundary than your Springbrook residential target area. And then what you would need to consider if you wish to is whether those boundaries might change at some point in relation to, for instance, the 2020 comprehensive plan package. So you have your hearing tonight and you are scheduled to take action on this on July 6th. That is it from me, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. There being no public comments, I declare the public hearing closed. We now move to ordinances. Ordinance number 736, Madam Clerk.
Ordinance number 736, authorizing the acquisition of real property under threat of condemnation or by condemnation for park purposes, authorizing payment thereof from the city's general fund or from such other monies that the city may have available or attain for the acquisition, providing for severability and establishing an effective date.
For this, we have Ms. Wachter.
Good evening, Mayor Anderson, Deputy Mayor Whalen, members of the council. Before you is ordinance number 736. It starts on page 114 of your packet. If you'll turn your attention to page 124, there is a map of sorts. Specifically shows what could be done with the area. If you look on page 124 specifically, you will see an area that says new open lawn. There's also been some talk about whether or not a basketball court could go there or something of that nature. In that area that says new open lawn, there were originally 3 residential houses. Those houses were between 127th Street and Clover Creek. 2 of the houses have been purchased and are now gone so that it's open land, leaving just the one house in the middle between the street and Clover Creek in that park. The city had looked at that and realized that it kind of completes the park to do that, so that's your public purpose. This particular parcel has a little bit of a history. If you look at pages 119 to 122 of your packet, there are parallel tracks going on. There was some code enforcement activity going on at the property. The owner has complied with the minimum requirements to keep the property on the right side of code enforcement. And so we haven't gone through abatement with the property. On the other side, there is the history of our efforts to work with the owner to perhaps purchase the property, and that has not been successful either. We are at this time looking at eminent domain as a way to acquire the property for fair market value, and it has been appraised. Kenan Williams is on the line at this point, and he can answer particular questions with regard to this acquisition. As the council's well aware, we have received any number of public comments and so forth, and it makes it a little bit different than some of the other condemnations we've done in appearance. But I think Mr. Williams will concur with me when I say it doesn't make it different than other eminent domain cases in any other way other than appearance. Mr. Williams?
Good evening, Council. As Ms. Wachter described, this property, from my review of everything, has gone through a long period of, well, disrepair, et cetera. But that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing in this instance is simply completing the park. The property is owned by Mr. Brandy Lewine. He purchased it approximately 4 years ago in August, will be 4 years ago. There have been a number of different attempts to acquire the property, sometimes where he's agreed to sell the property, and then for whatever reason, the deals never got consummated. We have been in contact with him for over a year now. I personally have been working on this case for over a year now with Brian Fagerness, who is the acquisition agent that is routinely used by the city. We have went out, looked at the property, tried to inspect it. Mr. Lewine has been uncooperative, however, in allowing any type of true inspection of the property. So it will have to be re-inspected and reappraised at some point when we get into actually into court, unless we can get a deal wrapped up. That's where we are right now. What we'd like to do is, this authority, we will continue to negotiate, but also begin the eminent domain process so we can move this along, set the date for valuation, and get it on the calendar.
Mr. Whalen.
Just had a question perhaps for Ms. Wachter here. I'm not aware of any particular funding deadline that we stand to miss by way of conservation futures money or otherwise that we would miss by not pursuing this opportunity now, as opposed to waiting when Mr. Lewine might be in a position to actually sell voluntarily.
We have already burned through the deadline that would have applied for the conservation futures money.
Right.
The only thing that we would miss that I can think of is fluctuations in the housing market. And I don't know, and perhaps Ms. Dodsworth would be better able to answer this question. I don't know to what degree the presence of the house in the center of the block area between that street and Clover Creek, to what degree that inhibits potential development of the park. When I looked at that map, it made me realize that you have clear park area, but for this one property, literally right in the middle of the block. So that I just don't know exactly what those plans are. I know she has shared with you different plans over the years. And so I don't know whether that's something that's 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, you're going to do right away. But I would cede to Mr. Williams again if he has other thoughts on that, because he's done a lot more condemnation cases than I have.
Yeah, Councilmember Whalen, the only concern that I have is that while we could simply sit and wait it out, the property in all actuality is subject to the taking of the city. The city is the only reasonable buyer, the only logical buyer for this property. So in effect, we're just delaying the inevitable. Maybe that's okay, maybe that works well, but the problem is that it really doesn't allow for much resale value of the property other than to the city. The city has to pay fair market value, ignoring the project influence. And I guess when looking at it in total, there are some opportunities here. Hopefully some education to the seller will help, understanding that he's eligible for relocation, certain things like that.
The other component that I would add that we've seen Mr. Lewine actively do is that, as Mr. Williams indicated, this is a matter of time. It could be now, it could be next year, it could be the year after. However, while for most people that would mean they can sit tight and wait for us, Mr. Lewin has demonstrated an active interest in doing more to improve the property while it's there waiting for us to condemn it later. So it is possible that as this goes along, he will put up something beyond the shed. He will continue to do things with the property, and that could accrue some consternation on his part, if not something actionable, something more active than what we've seen even now. Sometimes people do just sit there and wait. I
Yeah.
don't get the sense that's Mr. Lewin.
So consternation aside, remind us what the property is currently zoned as.
Open space. It was
Right.
zoned multifamily through, I think, July of 2019. And at that time it changed. And I will share with the council, we found out today that the city's posted zoning map had not been concurrently updated. It is now updated. So it's possible that somebody would have looked at that map and thought that it was multifamily. But I confirmed that the legislative action by the council took place in July of 2019. It is no longer a multifamily zoned area.
So in fact, it's a legal non-conforming use at this point.
That is correct.
So would it not be true, Mr. Williams, that waiting is not necessarily to Mr. Levin's advantage, because the market value of non-conforming property may certainly be worth less next year, 5 years from now, than it is today?
That's correct. And it's a little bit tricky too, because there's issues involving the project influence rule, whether or not the park is a project influence, whether the open space is a project influence. But the reality is that he won't necessarily be able to do many improvements on the property other than paint it and keep it there. But in the future, if you would be looking at probably an inverse condemnation action in the future, if he turned around and tried to sell it, and he would say, wait a minute here, you've zoned me out of existence here. You've taken my property in that way.
Is there a possibility, as opposed to pursuing this particular course of action, given what you've articulated as efforts to communicate with him and educate him, that there might be an opportunity outside of the condemnation proceeding to negotiate an option to purchase, should he at some point in the future be ready to sell?
There's always possibilities. I think that we need to, continue to explore those. And just so you're aware, out of all of the cases that I've handled for the city now, not one have we actually taken all the way to trial. We've always managed to work something out. The filing of the case just gives us a greater opportunity to get the parties at a table and start negotiating. We have similar cases to this up and down Bridgeport when we're doing projects like that, where you just can't get the answer. But this formalizes a negotiation process to
Got it. And assuming that negotiation process came to some fruition, Ms. Walker, we're still spending general fund monies as opposed to any other grant monies, conservation future monies, or the like, right?
The grant money ship sailed.
Right. So it's general fund money in the
Correct.
COVID timeframe when money's tight anyway that we're looking to spend.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Balky.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So Heidi or Ms. Walker, a couple of questions. So when did we already do an appraisal on the property?
We have an appraisal on the property that was, I'm not sure what the date was, and it may have been as a result of when the appraisal was done. It was done with the property as multifamily, and it came back at $99,000 at a time when Mr. Lewin, I think, had asked us for over double that.
He had requested $286,000.
Correct.
So,
Correct. Almost triple.
So at that time, of the appraisal, and that offer is still on the table, it was zone multifamily. Now the underlying is open space, which allows you to do what? Farm?
Yeah, not much.
Yeah,
Right.
I think
So presumably, as the value sits today, it's much, much less than it was when it was zone multifamily.
And less than he would have gotten had he been willing to accept conservation futures money. His
And the
proposal-
and the reason we did all three parcels at the same time, correct?
Correct.
Because we had signed documents that all three owners were willing to at least negotiate with conservation futures money.
Correct.
And the other two owners sold.
Correct.
Okay. And okay. So presumably the value of the property, if we negotiate in a year, is the value of open space under that. In fact, that's by law, that's all we can pay, correct?
Correct.
Well, so I just have to interject here for a second here to correct a couple of things. There is the argument that there's a project influence, is that the redesignation of the zoning is a project influence, and that you should continue to value it as if it wouldn't have been rezoned, the multifamily. However, I would like to point out is that Mr. Lewine purchased a property about 4 years ago for I think approximately $50,000.
$58,000.
Yes. So the property's gone up, but even with that change and even with the assumption that it is multifamily, it's still only coming in at $99,000.
I would note that the prior owner bought it at foreclosure sale. I think it was a tax foreclosure for $25,000, and Mr. Lewine bought it after it was listed as a tear down. And we don't know that any improvements have been made. Mr. Brandstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know who to ask, but when I look at the map on pages 123 and 124, one is the master plan for the park without the addition of the three parcels. It includes some projects, a dog park and other things that are projected to move forward in 2021 according to the legacy plan. And then we have the second map that shows with the addition of the three parcels, and some 2021 work is supposed to take place on one parcel that's adjacent to the creek involving invasive species and some things that are there. But generally, we've not really got an updated plan about what specifically would go on this particular parcel if we were to acquire it, other than that it would be park. It doesn't say whether we move the dog park over because it sort of sits right adjacent to the master plan where the dog park would end against it, or whatever. You know, we did get quite a bit of public comment on this, and I guess that I had a couple of reactions to the public comment. First of all, a lot of the public comment was just sentiment and moral support for the owner because he's a good person, which doesn't seem very relevant to the question before us. But there was I would note that in the range of comments that we received, there were no comments from residents of the neighborhood that were supportive of us taking this property and adding it to the park. And there is a question in my mind, you know, that there's a question in my mind about can we take the action that's before us? And clearly we can. So the question is whether we should. There's also a question as whether we want this property or whether we need this property. And we aren't at a point of where we with specificity excuse me, where with specificity, we would know exactly what we're going to do with it, what it would cost to go on. So then there was one other theme to the comments, and that was the owner has apparently been speaking disparagingly just about some of our staff and the way that they was dealt with it. And given that this is something where adding properties to parks and that we have dealt with going on, that we have, you know, I'm just categorically dismissed that as being going on. Staff has gotten generally very laudatory comments about how they've worked with folks when we've been in property things going on. But I guess when I come back to the want versus need question, we want it, but I'm not sure that the need amounts to the point that I want to proceed through an eminent domain, and I'm not supportive of passing the ordinance.
I have a question for, where'd he go? There he is, Mr. Williams. You moved in the box.
Oh, sorry about that.
Stay in that box.
Okay.
I think I know the answer to this, but Mr. Lowen has stated that he has used this property to run his construction business. When he was going through the code violation process, it was obvious he was using this as somewhat of a construction yard.
Yes.
In fact, materials at one point were piled on city property. He is not licensed to do business in Lakewood, and he is not registered as a contractor with the state of Washington. I assume we're safe in the condemnation process from having to pay him business relocation money. Is that correct?
That's correct. There hasn't been any indication that there's quote an active that he actually is legally operating a business out of there. Also, I don't know if you can legally operate a business out of that site at all. It doesn't appear so. And one of the things is that we have talked to him about different concessions. There's a big building that he constructed on the site, and he considers that his own personal property, and he would want to move that. And so we've treated that as personal property. There's another question as to whether or not I don't know about whether he's renting any of the rooms or not. Apparently he's saying they're their friends. We're saying, okay, if you're friends, they're guests, they're not tenants, things like that. There's all sorts of little issues surrounding this property that we're not getting straight answers on. Again, that doesn't go back to Councilmember Brandstetter's point. That doesn't really matter. The question is do you want to acquire this property at this point? Do you want to add it to the park? But I could see why, based on what you're telling me, you would, because of the fact that there will be construction debris lined up over there that wasn't supposed to be. I read the hearing examiner's report on the abatement, and one of the things that he noted was that, okay, fine, you're not in violation of this code, but you probably are, and I'm giving you a warning that you're in violation of other codes.
Okay, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Wachter, is our current offer for this property still $175,000?
To Mr. Loween, no, that we could not offer that at this point because it's been appraised at $99,000. 175 is too far above that. It would constitute the risk of being found to be a gift at that point. We may have made that offer back when it was Conservation Futures money.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Williams, you're next.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead, you're going to speak.
Okay, I was going to say something. I think there was some sort of a whole project estimate of around $175,000.
Fiscal
But
note.
the actual purchase of the property would be at this point limited to $99,000. However, he would be entitled to relocation benefits, which we made an estimate of approximately $20,000, maybe a little bit more, plus or minus. And then he gets advisory services and things like that, that all add up a little bit. But we had estimated the total project cost at around $175,000.
Well, that leads me to you, Mr. Williams. You mentioned earlier that there were other options that could be explored. Could you elaborate, please, on maybe 1, 2, 3 options other than the one we have before us tonight that we could explore?
Okay, within the eminent domain process, one of the things that we always try and do, which we have been do, is we have been trying to work out an agreement with Mr. Lewine. Mr. Lewine has sort of done the push me, pull me, where he says yes and then he says no. It isn't a question of whether or not he's willing to sell, because he's clearly indicated that he's willing to sell. It's just at what price. It's always that point of negotiation, because he did come back with his own analysis as to why he thought his property was worth substantially more than our appraisal. So within the realm of options that we have, number one, we can agree to a certain price, but then delay the take date. In other words, the acquisition price, just like a delayed closing. We could do something like that. I would caution against the city getting into a lease back situation where we acquire the property and then lease it back to him for an extended period of time, because that's wrought with problems, especially a property that has the history that it has with it right now. But within all of those realms of possibility, either paying a little bit more if we can justify it. I always want to hear and find out from his own appraiser what he thinks that it's worth, and then we can judge the risk of that. We can figure out what the relocation costs are. We can delay the move there. And under relocation, he has up to 18 months from the time that he moves in order to make a claim, and then we have to pay those costs. So within that whole realm, I think if it is in fact a problem that he's saying, geez, I can't replace this property, I think that what he's trying to do on this property is best suited someplace else where he could take this money and have us pay to move him to a new location that would be better suited for his use. And the timing of that could be part of the negotiation.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Caulfield.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to get back to Mr. Brandstetter. I believe he asked a question regarding the work that's going to be occurring out at Springbrook Park. And it's actually 3 components that will get underway later this year and into 2021. The 3 components on either side of the creek. The first is curbs, gutters, and sidewalks along 47th Avenue, again, on both sides of the creek. Secondly, the creation of open lawn space on both sides of the creek, which would include these 3 parcels, of which the city has already acquired 2. And then the third component would be the restoration of Clover Creek itself. So that is the next project that is coming online at Springbrook Park.
Mr. Whalen.
Well, I can speak now, or we can wait till there's actually a motion on the table. I don't think we have a motion on the table yet.
No.
So I will wait for my comments until there's a motion on the table, but thank you.
Okay, Mr. Volkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So my question is to anybody can answer. Given how long it's been since we got an appraisal, don't we need to get another appraisal?
The appraisal that came back at 99 is sufficiently current. We are considering something more current going forward, because you're right, it's not getting any younger, but we are confident, based on the zoning, that whatever future appraisal we get is going to be impacted by the open space zoning and a direction that doesn't favor Mr. Moline.
So my next question is, we've purchased other property. In fact, there was the second property, and it actually predates my time on the council, that the city purchased next to the original Springbrook Park. There were people living in that home for umpteen years after the purchase. And I believe at Wards Lake Park, we purchased at least one property that had a home on it. And there might still be people living there. I don't know, maybe in the last year or two, we finally moved them. So we have been very patient. Do you see that as possibly occurring here until we're ready to make the improvements to the park?
Mr. Caulfield.
Thank you, Mayor and Councilmember Boki. I can't speak to Springbrook Park in terms of who was in that home at one time, but at Wards Lake Park, you're correct. The city has had people in there. We've actually had a caretaker in there who's actually been a city employee. So that's who we've temporarily had in that property. As it relates to Springbrook Park, I wasn't here when that all happened. But again, just wanted to provide some background on Wards Lake. It was for care to have somebody on site to look after not just the buildings that we had there until we determine what to do with them, which ultimately we're in the process of demolishing, but also to keep an eye on the park.
Well, and to tag on to that a little bit and to echo something Mr. Williams indicated, an arrangement like that could be reached if we reached an agreement with the property owner after quite a bit of time, at least a year. Williams has been involved. We don't have an agreement. We've had agreements and then we haven't had agreements. So there's a little bit of nervousness there, but we could reach an arrangement where the person stays in for some amount of time after we've actually purchased it.
All right. Don't see any hands up. This would be appropriate time to entertain a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move approval of motion number
Ordinance.
number 736.
Is there a second? Is there a second?
I'll second the motion for purposes of getting it on the table for discussion and a vote.
All right. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This has been a tough one for me to work through. I agreed with a statement that Mr. Brandstetter made. I noted too that in all the comments we got, no one spoke in favor of expanding or bettering the park. It was all about Mr. Lewin. I also appreciate what city staff has tried to do with this gentleman. I have the feeling from what I've learned is that he can be a bit of a challenge. I have visited his property on 3 separate occasions. I'm very well aware of what it looks like before and after he's cleaned it up. I can't speak otherwise to his state of mind or where he is in this, but I do also believe that city staff has acted in the best interests of Mr. Lewin as well as the city. I also appreciate, Mr. Williams, your insight, particularly on the part of educating him, Mr. Lewin, about what he faces. So when you asked in another setting, do I think we have the money to do this? My answer is no. We have other issues, economic issues before the city that I think take precedence over the purchase of this property. Do I have the desire to do this? Absolutely not. I say that for several reasons, and this is where it's been a little more of a struggle for me. we're a council of well-meaning, good people. Probably all more intelligent than I am. And I have heard it said repeatedly by us that we do fight above our weight class. You look at the hard work this council has done since I've been on it, and I haven't been on it any longer than, I mean, outside of you, Councilmember Farmer, we're youngsters compared to the rest of them. And I'm proud of the work we've done. But Mr. Levine does not strike me as somebody above our weight class. We can do this because we can do it. And that bothers me. So I come back to something that Mr. Williams said. And if I have a recommendation, it is this. We continue to work to get that man to yes. I realize it's hard. I realize I'm not the one doing it, but I think that is the best way to go. Because until that happens, I will vote against this. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Whalen.
Thank you. I first want to applaud staff's multi-year effort at this, both in terms of communicating with the property owner and trying to educate him on the process and the opportunity. So this has nothing, I have nothing to say but good things about all the work that the city has done on our behalf. You know, that said, it goes back to want versus need, as Mr. Brandstetter indicated. I was all on board with this several months ago, maybe it was even a year ago. The time is starting to fade when we had conservation futures money to utilize for this. And it appeared that we had an amicable purchase agreement with the gentleman who understood the value of the property based on the appraisal that was then done. And we didn't have the need to expend general fund monies to make the purchase. So it was kind of a win-win. I no longer feel that way. And, I went out there today to take a look at it before considering this motion this evening. I wanted to take a look for myself to see what it looked like. And again, from a want versus need standpoint, in the absence of an imminent loss of funding monies that would otherwise be available, which they're not, in the absence of a critical need to expand the lawn and open space area, which from my observation, there isn't. I mean, there's a huge amount of lawn area out there already. Yes, this would expand it, but do we need it right now? I don't think so. So when I'm balancing the concerns and, Mr. Levine, I know he's probably a sharp individual with regard to his own needs and wants and desires, but what I probably do know about him is he's probably fearful. He's a guy that likely doesn't have a lot of resources, and he looks at this home of his, which is indeed his home, as a place not only to work out of, whether or not that's legal or illegal based upon what permit he does or doesn't have. He has a place to live, and I think it's challenging for folks to think about in this economy and environment to find a place to live that's affordable with $100,000. I just think it's challenging. You can't buy another home, or it's difficult to buy another home for that sum of money. And yes, could he rent a place? Maybe, but that's not our decision to make for him. So, I'm concerned about the taking of low-income housing when it's not a win-win scenario. So I'm going to vote to defer action by saying no to this motion. I don't think there's a rush to develop this park property right now. We don't have the money in terms of outstanding conservation future monies or any other grant monies. And I think it's important that, as Mr. Simpson indicated, we keep an open ear for opportunities down the road. Maybe a lease option or a right of first refusal for the city that can be negotiated. It saves the city money in the short term and may save the city money in the long term. Because what Mr. Levine doesn't probably recognize is that the value of this property may not get better with age, given the zoning. And even if 2 or 3 years down the road, where we don't have project influence at bay or at present, this property may not be worth what it is today. And that's a risk he has to take. It's a risk we have to take. But I think it's one I'm willing to take because I'm going to vote no.
Mr. Bulkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A few comments. First of all, we did receive a lot of comments. most of the comments opposed to it, I believe, were received from outside the city, from members as far away, I think, as Edmonds. I appreciate their interest in our affairs, but I don't know what weight I put to that. The people of Springbrook, the Springbrook neighborhood, have our parks plan. Our parks plan says we're expanding the park. Our goal is to expand the park. We have stated that publicly. So their expectation is that we'll continue to expand the park. They don't have to vote every time they want to expand the park on a park that we've already zoned as open space, parcels that we've zoned as open space to expand the park. That's their expectation as put into our Parks Legacy Plan and is put into our zoning. So what it gets down to is I think our staff has bargained, the city, the people of Lakewood have bargained in good faith with 3 owners on 47th Avenue. We had a way to pay for all 3 items, and that was through Conservation Futures, which are paid for, by the way, by the taxpayers of the entire county, including the people of Lakewood. 2 of the individuals, or 2 of the owners of those properties, bargained in good faith. It's my understanding we don't even go forward with Conservation Futures until we have at least some information from all 3 owners that there will be a willing seller. I don't know that the current owner of this property is ever going to be a willing seller, and I'm not in agreement that he is ever going to be. He will actually be emboldened by this action, knowing that we're unwilling to go forward. So the people of Springbrook have spoken. They want an expansion of their park. The way that property sits on that park, it's not off in some corner. It is an attractive nuisance. Nobody can do any recreation immediately around that property. And it devalues the 2 parcels that we already purchased with Conservation Futures. Now, you talk about credibility with people. I would say that our credibility with the Conservation Futures people, who already have had questions about should they be purchasing properties in urban parks, because we're competing against farms and open space in other areas of the county. Now, it couldn't happen, right? We came to them and said, hey, we've got 3 parcels that we want to buy. We think we have willing sellers. And it's like, oops, we only have 2. Oops, we didn't do anything on the 3rd parcel. So I'd be very careful. I also think that it sets the example that if we're not willing to do this for parks, which is an allowable use, just like roads, the founding fathers said in the United States Constitution that governments can condemn because they knew these kind of things would happen. Now, whether or not they thought about urban parks, I doubt it, but they had this in mind. A no vote on this is a real step back on the ability to do a downtown park or any other expansion of an urban park. So, you know, I would just be, I'm very aware of that, because if everyone knows, I put up a few emails from out of town folks, make some noise, we'll back off. I don't know where this is going to go. We bargained in good faith. Our city staff has bargained in good faith. We've used taxpayer money on 2 of those 3 parcels already. And walking back from this one, just because a few folks say, hey, we don't want an expansion of a park, and most of those folks that send us emails don't even know where it is. It's not their neighborhood. They don't live there. They're not trying to improve their neighborhood. We're trying to improve that neighborhood. We've had a long-term commitment to the people of Springbrook, and we need to continue that commitment. So thank you.
So I might have a perspective on this that is a little different from others. Back in the 1960s, W.A. and Vivian Howe owned an 800 square foot Craftsman that had been inherited. It was in poor condition, had a badly leaking roof, needed some foundation work, but it's the only place that they had lived and they'd raised their family. It's now left field at the Marshfield High School in Coos Bay's baseball field. They were my grandparents. They literally didn't have the proverbial pot. And it turned out well. They ended up in a better place in their retirement with the money, moved to a place where my grandfather could fish. They still didn't have any money, but they couldn't have fixed that house up and made it presentable so that anybody else would really want to buy it. As female sports expanded, the school district needed more baseball fields, and it was logical. I miss a memory when I go back there, but not too badly, because the last memory is the place by the river where they got to fish. So it's not the end of the world. It's disruptive to an individual. But when you think of Springbrook, it's probably the most economically challenged area in the city. It's underserved in many different ways. This park has been created through a hodgepodge of acquisitions. And this is literally a missing link that will take the park out to 47th. And as Mr. Bulkey said, we're losing some credibility if we ask for conservation futures money and then we don't really link it up. I'm disappointed that things couldn't be done with good faith negotiations, and they still have a chance. I have also represented folks on the other side of the equation, and remember an instance with way back when the Sewards were going into Lakewood, and the vacant lot where my clients were going to build their dream house was the low point. That was a natural location for a sewer pump station. And it was all emotion. They ended up getting more money than they possibly could have got for it. And it wouldn't have been that great a house, a place for a home anyway, but things worked out. And that's why you have fair value. Yeah, that's why you have relocation expenses. Sometimes for the greater good, you have to make a difficult choice. Is there any other discussion, questions, comments before we vote? Well, all in favor of the motion on the ordinance, please signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. All opposed, nay?
Nay.
Nay.
Okay, Madam Clerk, roll call vote, please.
Deputy Mayor Whalen,
No.
Councilmember Boki,
Aye.
Councilmember Brandstetter,
You got to take it off mute, Mike.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Brandstetter,
Nay.
Councilmember Farmer,
Aye.
Councilmember Moss,
Aye.
Councilmember Simpson,
Nay.
Mayor Anderson,
Yay,
4-3, ordinance passes.
thank you. Now move, and thank you for joining us, Mr. Williams. You can turn your meter off. We now move to ordinance number 737, Madam Clerk.
Ordinance number 737, adopting amendments to the Lakewood Comprehensive Plan, including future land use map and zoning map and Lakewood Municipal Code Title 18A.
For this, we have Ms. Spear again. Just spool her up.
Good evening again, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen once more. And as you just mentioned, this is the package for the 2020 comprehensive plan and zoning map amendments. Oops. A public hearing was held 2 weeks ago. So on June 1st, there was one comment letter received, which was in support of proposed amendment 2020-05 as recommended by the Planning Commission. And then there was discussion and direction from the council that evening that there be potential action brought forward for council consideration this evening regarding amendment 2020-06, which is related to the Springbrook neighborhood. So what you have in your packet starting on page 125? Yes, 125 is the full packet, and then starting on page 140, you'll find the resolution that's related to adopting the package. Within the resolution itself, the language presumes the council would take action to approve exactly what the Planning Commission recommended. In order for the council to take some sort of action related to 2020-06 Springbrook, and the conversation has been around whether or not to take action in 2020 to rezone those parcels into industrial land use designation and zoning industrial business park, there would need to be an oral amendment before council took action on the ordinance to make that change. And then there's also been a notification that on page 140, page 1 of the ordinance, there needs to be an amendment as well to insert in the fourth whereas clause. I'll just read the entire thing. In compliance with the requirements of the GMA and following abundant public outreach and involvement, the Lakewood City Council adopted the City of Lakewood, and then following that word Lakewood needs to be inserted comprehensive plan via ordinance 237 on July 10th, 2000. So that oral amendment needs to happen regardless, and then the council needs to consider whether to change the resolution related to this, or excuse me, the ordinance related to this to include action on amendment number 2020-06. So this is very quickly a recap of all of the applications and what was recommended by the Planning Commission. Approval of the first one. The second was a redesignation to a different zone and designation, excuse me, than the applicants originally requested. Approval of the third and fourth as they were submitted. Redesignating on the fifth one as changed by Planning Commission to multifamily designation and multifamily 2 zone. 2020-06 I just mentioned. Whether or not the council wants to take action this year would require an oral amendment. And then removing number 7 because it's a single parcel, meaning it needs to be handled in a different legislative process. And then numbers 8 and 9 were approval. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have or step out of your way.
Seeing no question, Mr. Whalen.
Thanks. Ms. Spear, I had a quick question on if you could pull up the chart again that you just had with the different projects.
Sure.
Or I should say the proposed amendments. So the Washington Boulevard and Interlochen Boulevard. So if we remove that from the docket, given it is potentially a site-specific rezone, it also gives us a chance to actually see how that property may be impacted by the final design work that's going into place for the whole boulevard reconstruction and development, correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me because there may be some different issues down the road once that final design is done.
Yes.
Okay. What is the effective impact of 2020-02 with the Planning Commission's recommendation to redesignate from multifamily to MF2? It's a density issue, right?
Yes, and the way it was originally requested, it was actually multifamily 3, which was a higher density. And
Right.
after discussions with the property applicants and then conversation with the Planning Commission, all parties were agreeing that multifamily 2 was not only responsive to what the applicants were hoping to do with the property, but would be more consistent with the properties around it.
What is that the same with 2020-05?
2020-05, that is also in response to a number of public comments that were received at the Planning Commission's public hearing. This was originally suggested to go to neighborhood commercial. Forgive me if I get that wrong. But in any event, it wasn't allowing anymore some of the multifamily projects that are either actually submitted to the city or are about to be. And there were a number of property owners saying, hey, we want to be able to have more residential options along this road. And so multifamily 2, again, is similar, complementary, or the same as properties around it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Spear, you mentioned the need for a motion amendment to correct the one whereas, but could the mayor just not note that the missing words comprehensive plan are a Scrivener's error and just direct that text be changed?
Certainly they could, yes.
We could include that in the motion, which hasn't been made yet. Mr. Branstetter, do you have anything further? Your hand's still up. All right, entertain a motion on ordinance number 737.
I would move to adopt the planning advisory or the planning commission's recommendations for each of the proposed matters.
And would that include the correction to the Scrivener's error mentioned by Mr. Branstetter?
Yes.
Is there a second?
There is. So seconded.
Mr. Whalen, seconded by Mr. Simpson, that we adopt motion ordinance number 737 with the correction as noted.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Volkey.
I would like to make an amendment to CPA/ZOA 2020-06 Springbrook neighborhood to amend on page, using the language on page 129 of our packet. It is 3 things. It was 1, amends the comprehensive plan land use map to designate the subject property in the Springbrook neighborhood area to industrial I. 2, amends the zoning map to zone the subject property industrial business park IPB. And 3, removes the Lakewood Station District sub-area LSDS boundary located within Springbrook, and it gives the location and parcel numbers also on that page.
What's your amendment?
That's the amendment
Okay.
on page 129.
Mine went away. Let's see. So would you? Yes, if I didn't understand your amendment, Mr. Volk, your
Yeah, I'm taking the language on page 129 for the comp plan amendment to 2020-06 for the Springbrook neighborhood.
okay, so you're amending to add the planning commission's recommendation.
No, I want it amend. Well, I didn't know that was a recommendation.
Mr. Mayor,
I guess I don't understand what the status of that is.
Mr. Mayor.
But it's fair. Ms. Spear.
Yes, thank you. The Planning Commission's packet recommendations is to take no action on 2020-06 until next year, because at the time they took action, they were not aware, nor was staff aware, that the Lomer report was being withdrawn. And so they were thinking that you would wait until that process was completed, and in the 21 cycle, action would be taken to rezone potentially. So this new language that Mr. Boki was just referring to on page 129 is what we as the city are recommending to you as the language to insert instead of the Planning Commission's recommendation in order to take
Okay.
action on Springbrook this year.
Into the 2020-06 beginning at the bottom of page 131 and going on to the top of 132. So that would replace that language. The language on 129 would replace the language that's currently in there on 131 and 132 for 2020-06.
I would accept that as a friendly amendment.
Yeah, we'd already had a second, so
Oh, okay.
do I have a second on the amendment?
So we had this discussion last week, Mr. Mayor. I
Yes.
believe.
Second.
We have a second from Mr. Whalen. Okay,
Thank you.
Mr. Bulkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We had this discussion last week as to what to do. And there's this option or the option of implementing some temporary zoning. But now that we're not going ahead with this LiDAR thing or whatever we call it, we might as, I think staff's recommendation is well put, and I'm supportive of it.
Yeah, now that I understand it, this may have come through the planning commission if not for the pending potential change to the FEMA map.
Right.
Is that correct, Mr. Caulfield?
Affirmative, Mayor.
All right. So if there's no further discussion on the amendment, vote on the amendment first. All in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The amendment carries. We now move to the motion on ordinance number 737 as amended. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Bulkey.
Mr. Mayor, as the council's liaison to the planning commission, I just want to mention the hard work of the planning commission on these. They did receive a fair amount of public input. Most of it was on the one dealing with Steilacoom Boulevard, and that was a challenge. And I think that they made changes based upon the public input that they received, and really worked hard at it. So over the course of several meetings and several months. So I just want to acknowledge their efforts. I think they did a really nice job.
Agreed. So pass on the council's thanks.
Will do.
Any further discussion on the motion to pass ordinance number 737 as amended? Seeing none, will all in favor please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We now move to resolution number 2020-10. Madam Clerk.
Resolution number 2020-10, adopting a 6-year 2021 through 2026 comprehensive transportation improvement program.
For this, we have Mr. Ott.
Evening, Mayor Anderson, Deputy Mayor Whalen, members of the council. The city's at the final step in the process of updating the 6-year comprehensive transportation improvement program for 2021 through 2026. Updating the program is an annual process required by statute and to assure continued consistency with comprehensive planning goals and to evaluate current transportation needs. The TIP has been reviewed by both council during a study session on May 11th and the Planning Commission on May 20th, and has been advertised, and we held a public hearing on June 1st. To date, no comments have been received. The request to council tonight is final adoption of the program through the resolution 2020-10. At this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions the council may have.
Questions from Mr. Ott?
Looks good.
Can I entertain a motion?
So moved, Mr. Mayor.
And
Second.
it's been moved by Mr. Simpson, seconded by Ms. Moss, that we adopt resolution number 2020-10. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Ott.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
We now put to resolution number 2020-11, Madam Clerk.
Resolution number 2020-11, establishing funding principles and a budget to guide the expenditure of coronavirus relief funds distributed to the city of Lakewood by Washington State.
We're back to Ms. Spear, it looks like.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So one more time, I'm going to share the screen, but I'll be walking through what begins on page 223 of your packets. And that is the resolution number 2020-11. This is, excuse me, language I think you've seen before, just stating the background to COVID-19 and the states of emergency that have been announced since. The fact that in April or May, there started to be the conversation about CARES Act dispersal, and the 1.79 million was identified for City of Lakewood per its population. There's the uses identified for the funding. Jumping onto page 224 is where you start to see the funding principles that we put together based on the council's conversation in recent meetings. So the first one is, section 1 talks about funding principles. The first one is individual and family economic resilience. The second is business assistance. And then the third is vital government services. In section 2 of the resolution, you'll see a proposed budget, and this is based on conversations that the city council has had. So with the total budget of 1.79 million, about 20% of that is now identified for quote internal costs, and then the remainder is in external, so 80%. The way this now allocates the funding is you see 10% going to coordination with public partners, 35% to business assistance, and then 35% for human services. And the execution of the budget allowed expenditures is awarded to the city manager, and effective date as of this evening once the council were to take action. So I'm happy to answer any questions or leave it to the council for action.
Questions for Ms. Spear?
I have one question if I can find the hand raised. Quick question for Ms. Spear. Just remind me what the coordination with public partners 10% means in reality.
That is the funding, for instance, for the Korean Women's Association that was applied for, or the fire department, the public library. So it's not private businesses, it's other agencies or public service organizations.
Got it. So it's not the nonprofits, not the private businesses, it's the others.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Just to show you how fast this changes and why I believe it's necessary to have this flexibility built in. Saw the KWA application to the city for $50,000 to provide delivery of meals to seniors, people who would normally come and eat meals at senior center, but senior center's closed kind of thing. Well, while we have been moving on this, the county signed a contract for $450,000 with KWA to do that countywide. So there's a lot of that going on at the same time. Got cities and counties and the state, and a lot of moving pieces. So it will pay to be flexible. I entertain a motion on this. And
so moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Whalen, seconded by Ms. Farmer, that we adopt resolution number 2020-11. Further discussion, Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to commend staff for the budget that they're bringing to us with this resolution, based on our discussions previously, to increase both flexibility and the robustness of the funding for businesses and for individual and family resiliency.
I second Mr. Branstadter's comments. Any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay. The motion carries. Now move to unfinished businesses. Thank you, Ms. Spear. Any unfinished business come before the council?
There is none, Mayor.
New business?
No, Mayor.
Then we move to reports by the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I'd like to call on our city attorney, Heidi Walkner, to give you an update on potentially how council meetings are going to look actually at your next meeting, because it's unlikely that the governor and the Four Corners are going to continue to allow full virtual meetings and things like that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the city attorney, and she'll give you a briefing on that. And I understand her material that she's going to speak from is within your packet.
That's correct. Mr. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of the council, there's a brief memo on page 226 of the packet. And I want to make you aware that your city clerk did the lion's share of the work on that. And I get to sign off on it. It's it's nice when somebody prepares something well enough that all you really do is sign. But I know that we have said several times that the OPMA waiver is not going to be renewed. We do need to be prepared. There is eventually going to be a point when they don't renew it. We think this is the time. The expiration date is June 17th. The question becomes, how should the council proceed in order to comply with both phase 2 requirements and the OPMA if there are no waivers to it, because you're really held to both things. And so one thing I would remind the council of, and it's in the footnote in that page that we've provided to you on 226, the council rules have always allowed for remote participation by council members. To the degree that a council member wants to phone in or Zoom in, those are both possibilities with or without the OPMA. What is different is that we would have to open council chambers for public participation, because without the OPMA waivers, the live streaming is not going to satisfy the public participation requirement. The way that we would do that is that we would work to make sure that the facility is clean, that masks are available, that the rules that we're trying to follow are posted, and we would try to maintain social distancing. Even with people attending, the council could choose to participate remotely. On a related question, the council has been asking whether or not people could participate without feeling like they had to come to City Hall to do so, because forcing them to make that choice just to participate at the meeting is apparently an issue. And so we do think that there is a way to allow people to call in on Zoom, and we could do that for the council. The part that's of some concern is it's something that we haven't tried before, and we don't know the degree to which the quality of the call will be good, the council will be able to hear it. I mean, we've all been successful here, but we just don't know if somebody's internet will be on the fritz or whatnot, but we can certainly make that effort and see how it goes. Brianna Schumacher, your city clerk, is available if you have particular questions. She's definitely the expert on the logistics of putting these things together. So if you have questions, either or both of us are ready, willing, and able to answer.
Any questions? I would note that there was a email from the governor's office today, which indicated some optimism that the Four Corners would approve another extension. So you never know.
We will do this dress rehearsal every time, and we are ready, willing, and able when the time comes. We continue to kind of watch the traffic, and we'll be ready when it happens.
Thank you. That's Something new every day. Back to you, Mr. Caulfield.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, City Attorney. So one way or the other, we'll be ready, as she pointed out. Last week, myself, our senior policy analyst, Shannon Kelly Fong, and our government relations team, we met with Jake Fye, who's a state legislator from the Pierce County area, Tacoma 27th District, who is also chair of the House Transportation Committee. The meeting really focused on two items. The first was to give him an update on our Lakewood Landing project, and the reason being is because, you know, we're seeking different, you know, tools there, primarily, you know, the LRF, the Local Revitalization Financing Tool. He did explain that he had voted yes on that, and he just wanted to get an understanding of two things. One, the scope of the project, but also whether or not we were going to be seeking transportation funds in support of relocating, for example, the WashDOT facility. On that latter issue, we said absolutely not. That's an agreement that we have had with WashDOT since day one. However, what we are looking for are these other economic development tools. After going through the process, he nodded and he says, yep, okay, I understand what you're trying to do here, and that he expressed his continued support for LRF. So that was a good outcome there. The other part of the discussion, he wanted to give us an update on the fact that it was likely that, you know, not just the House, but the Senate, that there was going to be a new statewide transportation package similar to one that occurred in 2015. Don't know what the scope and size will be yet, but certainly it'll be a big one. And he wanted to point out that, you know, he was interested in continuing the HOV lanes from Tacoma, which are going to currently end at about 38th or so, and add a fifth lane all the way down to Thorn Lane. You might recall that WashDOT did a study of which the Lakewood was a part of back in 2016 and 17, and there were several alternatives there. One of the alternatives, which quite frankly is one that we don't like, is simply repainting the existing asphalt and concrete that's there. So kind of narrowing things down, but not replacing bridges or interchanges or anything like that. It would appear he is also not interested in that, but rather doing it what I would define as the right way, which is adding a brand new lane, which would result in having to replace bridges and interchanges and things like that, which would not just be beneficial for Tacoma, but also for Lakewood. You know, the one question that we had is, okay, what happens with the, you know, the choke point as you all of a sudden now go from 5 lanes down to 4 lanes because we're adding a 4th lane in the JBLM I-5 corridor. So he expressed his appreciation for us pointing that out. We also talked about the fact that, you know, as you look further south, you know, you have the Nisqually Delta, and then of course the work that Lacey and Thurston County and SSMCP, of which Lakewood is a part of, all the way down to Tumwater. And he expressed his continued support for the work that's currently underway there and working particularly with the Nisqually tribe. So overall, we thought it was a very good meeting and a good discussion with him, and certainly we're going to keep in contact with him, particularly as we continue out into the fall, but certainly during the session in terms of what might be introduced on both the House and the Senate side there. At your next meeting, next Monday at your study session, there's a couple of items on the agenda I just really wanted to touch bases on. One was Ms. Todd Kraus is going to be providing you an update on our first quarter finances. And I wanted to kind of just give you a real quick snapshot. So the general fund, our general fund revenues are compared to budget for first quarter collections versus projected budget are down 5.5% or about $633,000. And really that's all because of really the last half of March. So about 2.5 weeks. That's pretty substantial. However, we have been able to make up for that revenue loss because we've had expenditure savings totaling $736,000. And that's a reflection of the action strategies that were put in place, which is not filling any vacant positions, tightening our belt, things along those lines. Now, as we look out into the next quarter and through the end of the year, obviously, you know, those budgetary savings on the expenditure side are not going to be sufficient to offset any revenue losses. But I just wanted to let you know that that's some good news for first quarter anyways. Also compared to this time last year, so collections of revenue from 2020 compared to 2019 are down almost $1 million or 8%. So pretty significant drop there. But again, compared to budget, down 633 or 5.5%. The second part, or rather a second component of your meeting on Monday, is to provide council an update on the financial impact from COVID-19 from the pandemic. And we have broken our presentation down into 3 components. The first component is, okay, what's the revenue loss projected to be for 2020, 2021, and 2022? And we have developed 3 scenarios there. The first scenario is that the economy begins to recover sometime in 2021. We're currently defining that as based on what we know right now, because again, we're still in phase 2. We're not even in phase 4 yet. We don't even know what's going to happen, later this fall if there's a resurgence of COVID-19 cases. But based on what we know right now, we think that scenario is about a 20 or a 30% probability. The second scenario is that things really don't begin to recover until the latter part of 2021. We're viewing that right now at about a 50 to 60% probability, again, based on where we are today. And then the third scenario, which is really not so positive one, is that revenues continue to decline for 2020, 21, and 22, and don't begin to come back until 2023. And we view that as a much lower probability. But again, we wanted to show you the different scenarios of what could happen based on projected recoveries under different circumstances. The second part of the presentation is we want to focus on, okay, how do we get through 2020? I'll be frank with you, originally, and it would be focusing on that second scenario, which is things would begin to pick up the latter part of 2021. And we're also looking at, okay, trying to then balance the budget for 21 and 22. I don't think we're there right now. So what we want to focus on next Monday is, okay, how do we get through 2020? And right now, generally speaking, our strategy is, okay, we got some good, strong reserves that we can help manage cash flow and revenue loss through 2020. That is nowhere near going to get us there. However, then you add in the action strategies that we've already put in place, which we know are working. That helps. There could also be a little bit of COVID-19 monies, as you just heard from Ms. Spear, or additional money coming from the state or the county. That will help, though that's a real tiny portion. And then we're looking at doing an interfund loan from our fleet and equipment fund to again help the cash flow. And the only reason, I just want to be upfront with you, I think you know I'm not a big fan of that. But the only reason to do that is my recommendation is not to move into cuts, because there is a glimpse of hope that Congress is going to do something in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And I know Mayor Anderson, provided some feedback on that last week, and we too have been hearing the same things coming out of Washington, D.C. So rather than jumping in and cutting services and laying people off and reducing, what we want to try and do is build a bigger, longer, and stronger bridge. So that's the second component that we're going to have for you next Monday evening. And then the third component is a follow-up to what I've asked the department directors to do, which is to provide a list of, okay, if we have to make cuts in services across all city departments, what does that look like? What does 20% look like? And the reason for 20% is because we look like we're going to lose 20% of our revenues. I don't think we're going to need to go that deep, but I want to show council what that looks like. And since police and public safety is the largest component of our general fund budget, there's no way not to go into that component of our budget. So that's what we're gonna have for you, and that'll be at about the 10,000 foot level. And we want to present that to you. And the things that it doesn't focus on is things that, we have to do legally. For example, in development services, we have to do Growth Management Act, we have to do comp plan, or that's necessary, critical or core services. So for example, in police, that's police patrol. And something that's legally mandated in public works is NPDES. We have to have a city attorney. That's a legal requirement. There's certain court things that we have to do. So everything else thereafter is ancillary and completely discretionary. And so that's what we want to show you. But I think it's important that you get an understanding of that, so that if we do have to come back and cut services later this year, or as we look out into the next biennium, we'll begin to have an idea and begin to formulate a strategy and an approach to do that. So again, that's the three-pronged approach, an update that we expect to have for you next Monday evening. So more to come on that. Maybe switching gears, the farmers market kicks off on Friday at Fort Steilacoom Park, 3 to 7 p.m. Also at the federal level, the House introduced their transportation bill called the Invest Act, and this is at Washington, D.C., Congress. Highly unlikely that the bill will pass this year, but one of the things we noticed was it didn't include what medium-sized cities such as Lakewood have been asking for, which is a set aside, for example, the Build Grant Program or other federal grant programs, so that municipalities such as Lakewood and a number of other cities up and down the Puget Sound corridor, we're working together with them, can qualify for. Since it didn't, our federal legislative team, developed a letter to Representative Rick Larson, who sits on the Transportation Committee, signed by our city, our mayor, as well as 12 other cities, so 13 cities. Mr. Larson was a little caught off guard that he got this letter. Long story short, he has agreed because of that to introduce an amendment to the Invest Act to have a 30% set aside, not just for the Build program, which again previously was Tiger, but for all federal transportation grant programs. That might be a bit of a reach, but that's what we're asking for. This morning, he subsequently asked that we send that same letter to the chairs of the House Transportation Committee and Appropriations Committee, which we're in the process of doing as well. So again, we're getting our voices out there and getting our voices heard as it relates to transportation funding. Switching gears at the state level, you might have heard me mention about a month or so ago a commerce grant for climate change. That's something that we're going to have to incorporate into our comprehensive plan. And since there is some funding available to do that, we have submitted an application. Actually, we're in the process of submitting the application to obtain the $20,000 and get that work underway later this year. Again, council and mayor, it's something that we need to do. I think we need to be proactive on it, because if we don't, it's likely that PSRC and Commerce at a later date, whether that's next year or the year after, will make us do it. So my recommendation is to be proactive and do it up front and do it right and do what's in the best interest of our community. We continue to work on the Defense Community Infrastructure Program grant, including reaching out to our friends at JBLM to get her a letter of endorsement for the project from the base commander. So that is also underway. Also, Mr. Busich is going to be back in front of you in the near future to request the final appropriation of monies. I think it's $155,000 to get us to exactly 100% design on that project. And you might recall we held back a little bit when the contract award was considered back. I think it was in January or early February. At your next study session on Monday, unless there's any objection from the council, I'd like to recommend that Chief Zaro go over with this body our police manual of standards that serves as the policies and procedures for our police department, as well as the use of force policies. And by the way, both of those documents are on our website. In addition, I need to talk to the chief, but also our new SRT policies, I think would be good for you to see as well. And so, Mayor, I'll just leave that as a holding place. perhaps under council comments, that's something that you might want to talk about, but I wanted to let you know that Chief Zarro is standing by and available to do that at your next study session. Also, the chief is working with the community to.
You could discuss that with me, and under council rules, either you or me or any couple of council members can have that as agenda item. So I want it on the agenda. You're suggesting it should be on the agenda, so it will be on the agenda.
Okay, so it's on the agenda. Thank you, Mayor. The other is Chief Zarro is working with Larry Wood. You might know Mr. Wood. He is the chair of your Lake City Neighborhood Association to bring back the Lakewood African American Police Advisory Committee that I understand was in place a number of years ago. So we're working on that. Also at your next meeting will be a comprehensive update on where we are with Western State Hospital Master Facilities Plan. Our community and economic development departments, specifically Mr. Buer and Ms. Spear, have been contacted by the city of DuPont, and they have an interest, and they had mentioned this about a year ago or so to us, but they have an interest to add an urban growth area, a UGA, that would encompass a portion of our UGA that relates to JBLM North, as well as a portion of JBLM that's not part of anybody's UGA. And so we've had a couple of discussions with them on that. And so I think they're going to go through the process. And once that happens, I'll probably be back in front of you to see what you folks want to do, if that's something you want to support or not support. You can have overlapping UGAs, by the way, and ultimately it would be the county council that would approve that. I will say this, the one benefit of either giving up a portion of our UGA or partnering with DuPont and supporting it is that if sometime in the future we want to move forward with annexing JBLM into our city, having two cities would probably be more helpful. So just wanted to put that out there, but at this point in time, more to come on that. So just a bit of a warning order on that item. And actually with that, that is my report, Mayor and Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Caulfield? And I'll go to council comments before we go to executive session. Ms. Moss.
I'm good, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. My one thought is around June 29th. 29th is a fifth Monday. And given that we may well be able to be in a face-to-face meeting potential for doing that, I think we should try to look to try to make some productive use of that where we've been limited while we've all been on Zoom. And there are a number of options that we might want to devote that time to. I think Chief Zarro's presentation to us next week, could well lead into a broader discussion about how are we going to address the concerns in the community that are moving on and that we've talked about, but we need to listen and try to look at for some action. That would be one possibility. The other thing that might suggest itself comes out of the economic reports we're going to get next time. But I would encourage us to make use of June 29th, perhaps starting earlier, doing it in whether it's in a study session format or even in a modified retreat format to where we can just talk about things. Don't necessarily need a lot of staff preparation for it, but for us just get our thoughts back in sync. So I guess we should decide on that next week.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One of the practices that I made when or still use when I'm writing articles for various publications or companies or museums is I listen for a phrase that I can use, I can leverage to move to my point. And I'm going to do that tonight. I heard the city manager say in his remarks, he used the phrase "a glimpse of hope." And those 4 words brought together something that I had been noticing this week, or actually a little earlier than this week. When I first read on the 9th of June in the Suburban Times, an article entitled "No More Paper Plates, Now What? Thoughts on Navigating Through Life" by David Anderson. And while he and I don't always agree, the one thing that I have noticed about Mr. Anderson's writing is that there can be an elegance, a lyric quality to it. And in this piece that I cited, he wrote, "As a country and as a culture, with crisis major and more major upon major having brought us to what appears to be in the darkness an inability to reverse, to retrace, to return to whatever it was we were going, let alone find out where we went wrong." And he ends this piece by saying, "We have lost our way." And then I was reflecting on the video, Mr. Mayor, the Don Anderson. And you had talked about General Charles Q. Brown. And I noted in the 10 June issue of the Wall Street Journal, where the journal writes, "General Brown's patriotism and dedication shine through even as he recounts the difficult moments he's faced as people made judgments about him based on race. His thoughtful words offer an example to us all." And by the way, Mr. Mayor, I too also had the honor of meeting the man when the C-17s were first brought to McChord Air Force Base. And last, this past week, the 12th of June, 2020, in the Suburban Times, our deputy mayor wrote a very nice piece. And Jason, I apologize, I don't have the title of your piece in front of me, but it had to do with open hearts, open minds, open ears. Listen to people. And you concluded your remarks with our nation's motto, which was coined by John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. Those 3 wanted that as a nation's motto, and it is "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. So as I reflect back on what I read, I come back to Mr. Caulfield. There is a glimpse of hope here. We're part of that hope. We just keep doing what we're doing. We do it with, like I say, open hearts, and we listen. We're going to be just fine, despite what the budget report might look like. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Volkey.
Very well put, Mr. Simpson. I really do think that there's glimmers of hope. I was able to get my haircut this week or late last week, and I took that personally as a great glimmer of hope. But I really do think, we take things for granted and life gets in the way. And I think that, as tough as it is, and as tough as it is for folks out there, we can work through this, and I think provide good leadership for the city and as the people get through this. But it's not easy, but we'll get there. Thank you very much. That's all I got, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Farmer.
I don't want to overshadow Councilmember Simpson's words. Those were very inspiring, and I've had a very tough couple of weeks. So I do appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing the glimpse.
I don't, I had one client that would always call me and start out his latest problem with, I'm too old for this. And I would generally respond with something similar. And now it's almost like I didn't sign up for this, but I did sign up for this. I think we all did. And so we have to do the best with what we've got, listen, adapt. And as I've always told my kids, you can't go backwards. You can only go forward from where you are. So with that, Mr. Whalen, did I pass you?
That's okay. I don't want to add too much to it. I just want to say briefly that I am hopeful for the future. I think that earthquakes cause cataclysmic change, and sometimes social events also cause change. And I think in our case, we're going to collectively get our arms around it and help produce good change. One just one hopeful comment about the future. I attended my middle daughter's graduation from Oregon State COVID style. And I think that's appropriate for you, Mr. Mayor. You know, it's better to have more beavers out in the world than ducks. So she had a fine graduation ceremony with a small group of 10 kids and parents who wanted to do something for their kids because the university wasn't able to with COVID. So we rented out a little Marriott hotel room, conference room, and decorated the place. And the kids had a really memorable time. And again, in terms of hope, Mr. Simpson, from an educator's perspective, these kids reflected on their lives together for the past 4 years and the opportunities for the future, even though it was kind of a funky ending to an otherwise, you know, glamorous senior year of college. And it was a fun event. So it gave me hope for the future. And thank you all for your comments and your leadership. It's a good group we have. And I also want to say I'm on board with Mr. Brandstetter's use of June 29. I think it's a great opportunity for us to get together. And I would like to expand upon the topic that the chief will present us with next Monday.
Yeah, since I think that's another one of my trips that's been canceled. Sometimes I pick fifth Mondays. So now we will move to executive session. We will sign off on this Zoom meeting and go into executive session recess for approximately 20 minutes pursuant to RCW 4230-110-1B to consider the selection of a site or the acquisition of real estate by lease or purchase when public knowledge regarding such consideration would cause a likelihood of increased price. The council is not expected to take any action following the executive session except to come back and adjourn. So if you would sign off and then sign into the executive session, we're in recess. We're back in session where the executive session is complete. We're back from recess, and the being no further business to come before the council, we're adjourned at 9:30.
Thank you, Mayor.
Night.
Good night.